Unfortunately, in Israel today, we have 250,000 survivors, which is about half the survivors, and they have no voice. The public even protested, and there was a consensus politically even to give the survivors more money, and the finance minister, Roni Bar-On, vetoed it because there wasn't money in the annual government budget. As we say in Hebrew, Lani Ganu. To what point have we reached? And this is the issue. So it doesn't matter who you are, but you can have a role here. You have a role in the wake-up call. Everyone is astounded by Madoff. But the things that I'm going to say to you are unbelievable, and you won't believe them, but this is part of our moral corruption. The Holocaust is abused by people who make it a business, okay? And a tremendous amount of money has gone into cement, to museums. I agree with the general trend. And a lot of people and a lot of groups are ignored in the Holocaust commemoration, including the Sephardim, including people and groups which were central. Even someone, Peter Bergson, Hillel Cook in America. Yad Vashem decided he wouldn't be on the walls of Yad Vashem. Why not? Because the excuse was he did what he did outside of occupied Europe. But the real issue is because he was a revisionist. Okay, I'm not a revisionist. I'm not from the Israeli right. But the point is that what he did isn't recognized because he's considered not legitimate. And that is even despite the fact that Begin and Netanyahu were from the right and prime ministers. Okay, there's a certain tone. There's a certain tone that the labor movement initiated, which also is extremely decrepit, and that determines what our knowledge is of the Holocaust. It determines how we view history, and it determines how we overlook our fellow Jews. So because Hillel Cook was a revisionist, he was from Beirut, and he was in the diaspora, what he did to pressure and help create the refugee board in 1943, 1944 isn't considered a legitimate topic. In other words, in Washington, D.C., they can criticize, at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, they can criticize what the United States government did, but in Israel, at Yad Vashem, they won't criticize what the Jewish agency was doing then, and what all the others were. They won't mention that in the narrative. They won't mention that after Hitler took power in Germany and most of Eastern European Jewry was on the run and they had to flee, it was the revisionist movement. Jabotinsky, the illegal immigration movement, which was called Afal Pichen, that of those tens of thousands that were rescued, they did most of the work until 1939, 1940. During the Holocaust and afterward, it changed. But so even this is politicized. Okay? But I don't exonerate the Likudniks today for their role in ignoring the Holocaust survivors. But the whole picture is skewed. Okay? And Hillel Cook wasn't in Palestine then because he came to America to make noise. And he was ignored. And as successful as he was, he had very little impact. But the point is, in terms of commemoration, he's not legitimate. Okay? And it's just like no one appointed the American Jewish leaders, and no one appointed many of the Israeli leaders, where there's, especially in the Jewish agency, etc., etc. There's no democracy in terms of that. And in the last few years, because the survivors have gotten older and older, they have more problems. In other words, when they got out of the camps, they were young. And physically, many of them got over whatever problems they had. But at a much later age, they have much more complicated symptoms because of what they went through 50 and 60 years ago. And this is where the Jewish people have ignored them. And we're talking about 250,000 survivors in Israel. Okay? And you're talking about over 100,000 in America, and over 100,000 in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, where most of them are neglected, aren't being recognized as survivors, and aren't being even given any attention by the Joint Distribution Committee, who has grown also fat and irresponsible and corrupt. And this is a wake-up call, because you're all astounded by Madoff, but there's a lot of Madoffs out here. In Israel, we don't even know how much was not divided from reparations. I read in the Jewish Journal that since the beginning, 100 billion has been given out. That's even worse. That's probably an exaggeration to figure 100 billion. But Ilan Ziv, who made a film in America about the corruption of the system, quoted Israel Singer of an estimate of 20 billion, which is extremely low. Okay, the question is, if 20 billion was received, why wasn't 20 billion given out? Maybe only 4 billion was given out. Or if we're being more precise, maybe 40-some billion dollars was collected. And maybe less than 10 billion has been given out. And why is there an organization called Beit Tzedek in Los Angeles that has to help survivors process their applications? This is 60-some years later. In other words, the claims conference, to deflect from the survivors, just gave a grant to Beit Tzedek to help. The claims conference intentionally stalls, intentionally misleads people. A lot of the subject has been busted open because I pressured Nettie Gross, and she became the Holocaust investigative corruption reporter of the Jerusalem Post, a report which most of you don't even know about. Don't think it's a leftist magazine. It's an investigative reporting about corruption in the Jewish world. Okay, and it influences the Jewish world, because if dozens of survivors are dying a day of neglect, it's because of corruption. And you're all mad at Madoff for his stealing, but you're unaware of all the thousands who have stole parallel to him, and especially in New York. So, and Israeli politicians have no leverage over what has happened. And they don't care, and they're impotent. And what my plan is, but of course no one wants to do it, I want to have an official audit by the Israeli and German governments since 1953 where the money went. And then to bring all those people in New York who stole the money and
yeah, it's fine. Just keep going.
And misled the survivors, to have those that are still living brought to trial. The first time I lectured about this was in 1989 to the European community. All right? At the time, it made very little headway. But things are happening. So I pressured Nettie Gross for 9 months.
All right. Take it off the hook. Okay. We're back.
I pressured Nettie Gross for 9 months to write an article on why Sephardim don't receive reparations. Okay. Going back to Los Angeles, there was a lady in Los Angeles I know from my research who was in Auschwitz. She was deported from the island of Rhodes late in the war. She was only deported from Rhodes July 23rd, 1944. She only arrived in Auschwitz in August 1944. She was rejected 6 times by the claims conference because at the time she wasn't in the camp for 18 months. Since then, many things have changed. But she did not get what she deserved. Okay? She didn't even get a token by the Jewish people for the suffering that she should have gotten, and according to the regulations. Because in the end, it doesn't matter if you were even anywhere for 4 months, if you pressured enough, if you had someone who processed your application, you got it. But she was rejected 6 times. She was rejected just like the Mengele survivor in Los Angeles. She was rejected just like us, thousands of other people who even were